you very much. Very excited to be here today. So for starters, quick introductions. My name is Omar Bisram. I am the co-founder and CEO of Ankle. At Ankle, I have the good fortune of being able to work with our 100+ not-for-profit organizations. I started my career at KPMG, which was where I saw firsthand the pain points that not-for-profit organizations experience with their back office.
My name is Alex Olton. I've been with Ankle for about a year now. I'm the Director of Service Delivery at Ankle. Prior to joining the company, I worked in public practice. I worked with charities and not-for-profit organizations across Canada and met with many boards, many executive directors, and understand the decision-making process that they go through. I was also the member of a board of directors for a housing cooperative where I oversaw an asset management plan and implemented reserve fund policies. So I'm quite familiar with the subject matter.
Great. So just to tell you a little bit about Ankle, we're a Vancouver-based company. We started Ankle about 5 years ago with the goal of using people, process, and technology to become Canada's most trusted back office services provider. Today, we deliver our services in really these 5 different areas: bookkeeping, payroll, accounts payable, accounts receivable, and controllership services. So what we'll be covering today, we'll start with common misconceptions about reserve funds. We'll then dive into types of reserve funds and challenges, how to establish a reserve fund, how to determine the right amount of reserve, best practices for managing your reserve funds, and external audit considerations. So what is a reserve fund? Really, in its most basic form, a reserve fund consists of assets, generally liquid assets that is, set aside by the organization to provide funding for a planned future need or a cushion for unplanned events or expenditures. So why should your organization have reserve funds? Well, of course, in these uncertain times, reserve funds are a topic that we're discussing extensively with our clients. Making sure that the organization can sustain itself through tough times and for the long term is top of mind, given the uncertainty that we're faced with COVID-19, or that we've been presented with through COVID-19. So we've been having a lot of discussions on this area with our clients. And really, to sort of break this question down, top of mind for people today for why to establish reserve funds, really reason number 1 is to weather the rainy days. Does your organization have enough resources to continue operating in the event of a pandemic like we're in today, a natural disaster, or an economic downturn?
And I think it's very important for all organizations to maintain cash flow projections and to perform sensitivity analysis on those cash flow projections. That's going to give you a much better sense for how much you need to set aside in operating reserves.
So reason number 2, to plan for the long term. Are there assets that will need to be replaced? Could there be significant cash outlays required to evolve or maintain operations?
My comments to this reason actually are said again in the next reason, so we'll just cover it off once here. Strategic planning is really key. For this reason and the next, if you're not certain about how much you'll need to spend for non-routine goods and services, you won't know if you have enough set aside in reserves.
Right, which ties into the next reason here, which is to plan for new programs. Could there be significant cash outlays required to start new programs? How do you remain relevant in socioeconomic and demographic as demographic factors are changing? And do you need to adapt your programs to a digital format? So now moving into some common misconceptions about reserve funds. So the first misconception that we'll dive into is that having reserve funds will hurt our fundraising. Certain grant makers might not provide funding if the organization has a reserve. The reality, having reserves can boost your fundraising. Reserve funds are an indicator of responsible financial management, and funders should have more confidence in in the organization's ability to carry out its mission, where reserve funds are present.
And I'd really encourage you to ask if you really want to work with a funder that does not allow for sufficient operating reserves. One of my past clients was deeply impacted by this year during COVID-19. Previously, they had a very stable cash flow model, and there were really no concerns about not carrying a sufficient reserve. Well, COVID-19 turned off all of the taps for fundraising and service offerings. So there was about a 2-month period where I really questioned whether or not they'd be able to continue and weather this current situation.
So misconception number 2, endowment funds are the best route to financial sustainability. 1, they provide continuous financial support for a specific component of the organization's activities. And 2, activities could be as broad as supporting the operations of the organization or as narrow as providing scholarships to a specific course. The reality, endowment funds can pose problems in the long term. Risk of endowment forcing the organization to remain focused on an activity that they wish to deprioritize in the future. Also, market volatility can lead to unexpected changes in investment returns. Also, additional long-term governance and stewardship will be required by management or the leadership team.
I think it's very important for organizations to have a diverse revenue base. A combination of investment income, event income, fundraising activities, program, etc., really helps to allow for stability.
All right, misconception number 3, an unrestricted reserve is a bad thing. The reality, unrestricted reserves allow for the organization to react quickly to changing circumstances.
I have heard this conversation play out at almost every board meeting I've ever attended. There's really a balance here to be struck. The organization needs to appear to be on solid financial footing in order to attract further donors. But at the same time, it should not appear as though the organization has surplus funds, because that may hinder your ability to raise additional funds. So the advantage with having a certain amount set aside in an unrestricted fund is that the organization will be able to quickly react to changing circumstances. If these funds are set aside in an internally restricted fund, you would need to call a board meeting. You need to reach quorum. Then the board members would need to vote on it. And then you might be able to release some internal restrictions on these funds.
Great. So let's dive into this next section on the different types of reserve funds. We've touched on them a little bit already, but we'll get a little bit deeper into what they are. So what are endowment funds, internally restricted funds, and externally restricted funds? All right, jumping into endowment funds. All right. So trust is a critical factor in donor decision making. So the challenges, that presents boards and management teams with are extensive, of course. So some things to consider here: 1, consider having your financial statements audited. 2, ensure that you have a reputable, experienced treasurer. 3, communicate with stakeholders on a regular basis. 4, manage public perception and avoid controversies. And 5, plan on building long-term relationships with potential donors.
I mean, trust is really key in the not-for-profit and charitable world. Obviously these points are all about building trust and appearing to be a reputable organization. It's very important to manage the public's perception of your organization and consider your reputation in the eyes of potential future donors. Currently, most organizations are focused on a specific demographic or a specific group of individuals, but when we're 20 years down the line, that may change considerably. We'd also encourage everybody to consider the source of the funding received and how that might play out in the eyes of potential future donors.
Great. All right. Challenge number 2 with endowment funds. So how the funds are invested. Of course, decisions are hard in this current environment due to record low interest rates and market volatility, especially as we've seen this past year, donors want the money to last over the long term, and investments often need to be made within the guidelines provided by the donor. A few things to consider. So, of course, the risk versus reward when making investment decisions, and also working with a reputable investment advisor. All right, let's talk about fund management. So a couple things to consider here. First of all, find an investment advisor or a number of investment advisors with credibility. This is, of course, very important when they're being entrusted with a significant amount of money. And two, work with larger trusted institutions with a track record. From an investment allocation consideration perspective on the risk front, what can the organization handle in the short term and the long term? What is the risk profile of your donors? And also consider that future donors may be more or less risk averse and could make donation decisions based on the investment history and profile. Fees, this is one that I think often does not get enough attention. Are you getting the best value for your money? Is your portfolio manager able to report back at the level of detail required by your stakeholders?
And as you're working with your investment advisor, it's really quite important to understand your investment time horizon. How you invest a 30-year endowment fund will be very different from how you invest funds that you'll need in the next 3 years.
All right, endowment fund challenge number 3, fluctuating investment returns. So of course, fluctuating investment returns will impact your organization's ability to plan for the long term. You also need to ask the question, can your organization handle some near-term risk for greater long-term returns? Also, it's a misconception that absolute risk mitigation is always required. A few things to consider. So 1, forecast your organization's cash flow needs to understand your investment time horizon. 2, short-term cash needs should be easily accessible and be in lower risk liquid assets. 3, you can also use unrestricted or in some cases internally restricted funds to mitigate the impact of fluctuating investment returns. All right, internally restricted funds. All right, so there are really a few different types of internally restricted reserve funds. So let's just start with the definitions here. So there are operating reserves, which are used to cover the organization's operating expenditures in the event of unexpected funding shortfalls. There are capital reserves to save up for future capital purchases, such as new buildings, new equipment, or major renovations. And then there are other reserves, and these will depend on the requirements of the organization.
When I'm explaining these funds to new board members, I often use the following analogies. I think of operating reserves as your savings accounts. You don't want to dip into it, but if you ever need to, you know that you can. Capital reserves, I looked at my car fund when I was 15 years old. I'd set aside, $100 every paycheck, saving up for that car that I eventually bought when I turned 18. And then others, they could be for anything. It really depends on the requirements of your organization.
All right, let's jump into some of the common challenges with internally restricted funds. So 1, building trust with the board. So the management team needs to provide the board with the right data, historical or forecasted, to set aside the right amount of money to achieve the specified purpose. So really, as a management team, you want to make sure you're able to produce accurate financial results on a consistent basis. This is how you build credibility. And also, achieving the specified purpose. So the board really needs to believe that the specified purpose is achievable, and they need to ensure clarity and alignment in goals and objectives. So on that front, you should meet with your board regularly to review the financials and discuss if the balance in each internally restricted fund is sufficient.
think it's also important to recognize that the priorities of the organization do shift over time, particularly in the not-for-profit world, because we do have a number of boards where the membership turns over every 3 or 4 years. So it's important to discuss why these decisions were made in the past, but be open to changes as the organization moves forward. These decisions should be revisited and reaffirmed regularly through strategic planning.
Great. Let's jump into externally restricted funds now. All right. So some common challenges with externally restricted funds. One, of course, agreeing on specifics with the funder. So what you need to do there is really define and set goals for the funds. 2, administrative costs to deliver the program. So you want to add a provision for administrative costs to the administrative budget. And then 3, funder and donor reporting. So know what your organization can commit to and plan well in advance.
And when working through agreeing on the specifics with the funder, I do think that it's important to work with the funder to allow for some wiggle room in the future if the organization does decide to change course, and to perhaps consider putting a provision in the agreement associated with that. With the administrative costs to deliver the program, there's delivering the program, which does take up management's time. It could lead to the need to hire an additional person, but there's also, on the third point, reporting on the results of the program. So just reporting on the results can take a significant amount of time, and reporting on the financial side of it can take a huge amount of time if things aren't set up properly in advance. I've been involved with reporting back to IRAP on programs that had to be done every 2 months and then 3 months. They had a very funny reporting structure. But it would take, 2 or 3 days for the bookkeeping team to put those reports together.
Great. All right, let's jump into some best practices for external reporting. So it's very important to know what your organization can commit to. So before talking to your donor about the reporting requirements, you need to have an idea of your organization's reporting capabilities. Also, talk to your bookkeeper to find out what you can share. Can you track certain funds spent for the initiative or for a specified donor separately? And what is the reporting frequency? What I'd say here is knowing these things up front is quite key. Usually if you speak to your bookkeeper in advance, you can measure and track things specific to a funder program. It's very hard to do after the fact.
Yeah, there's a lot of research that goes back into what exactly was this expense for? Can we attribute it to this specific program?
And along that same line, so planning in advance. So after finalizing the reporting requirements, plan for your reporting requirements in advance. Provide the donor with a sample report at the outset, or understand what their template requirement is. And figure out if you need an audit or review engagement. First-year audits, review engagements can be time-consuming, costly, so know what you're getting into.
Yeah, and just from a personal perspective, if your executive director or your management team hasn't been through an audit before, it can be quite stressful for them to work through it, and that's why it's important to reach out to the external auditor in advance, get a really good understanding of exactly what they're going to be looking for, what sort of supporting schedules you'll need to prepare, because some of these things may not have been prepared in advance, but while it's certainly possible to create it all, audits and reviews tend to run on very specific timelines,
right.
And it's better to spend the time upfront preparing these rather than as the audit's ongoing. So how to handle a reserve fund? Or sorry, how to establish a reserve fund? So for an endowment fund, you're reaching a binding agreement with a third party. As you're establishing that agreement, it's important to discuss the short-term and long-term terms of the arrangement. For example, what should happen to the fund when the organization winds down, or can the organization move a percentage of the principal over to unrestricted funds after 10 years? I would say that with endowment funds, these do tend to be very well structured legal agreements. You do tend to be dealing with some fairly well-to-do donors. And as a result, it's also important to have the organization's lawyers review the agreement. For internally restricted funds, it's actually much easier. You just need to do this through a board resolution that clearly outlines the purpose of the funds. For example, we're going to put aside X amount of funds to purchase a new building in 10 years. We have another client that was putting, similar to my car example earlier, they operate a Meals on Wheels style organization, and they were putting aside X amount of money a year to purchase a new delivery van. It was going to be a significant cash outlay. It was going to require customization in order to store the food. So they saved up for that for, I believe it was 5 years, and acquired it this year. For externally restricted funds, I did want to say one more thing with internally restricted funds. It is also important to consider whether or not the creation of new internally restricted funds is allowed by the bylaws of the organization. So moving on to externally restricted funds, similar to an endowment fund, you're going to reach a binding agreement with a third party, although these do tend to be shorter term in nature. So ensure that you have a thorough understanding of the terms of the agreement and your reporting requirements. For example, the funds are used to be solely for nutritious hot lunches for all elementary school students in East Vancouver. That would be a good example of an externally restricted amount. Looking back at endowment funds and the advice to speak to a lawyer, this very well could be the case with externally restricted funds as well. Although if it's a recurring program that you sign up for every year, that may not be required. For internally restricted operating reserve funds, so do this through a board resolution and a reserve fund policy that clearly outlines the purpose of the funds, the definition of the reserve fund, the intended use, and the calculation of the target amounts. Assignment of authority for using the reserve fund. It could be a situation where whenever you want to use the operating reserves, you do need to get board approval, or it could be that the organization is allowed to use 10% of the reserve funds without board approval. Responsibility for reporting the reserve fund amounts and the use of the reserve funds. And other specific policies regarding the investment of the reserve funds. For something like a operating reserve fund, you'd want to have it in a short-term, very liquid, very safe asset. Whereas if you were setting something aside for use in 5-10 years, you may want to have it in a medium-term investment. So what is the right amount to reserve? I wish I had a very simple answer for everybody, because this comes up all the time. Is it sufficient? Is having sufficient operating cash flow for 1 month, 2 months, 2 years? It really depends on your revenue streams and the reliability of those streams. When I was on the board of the housing cooperative, we knew what our monthly revenue would be. And our target was 6 months because we were really only concerned about the expense side of things. However, if all of your money comes in through investments, those can be quite volatile, and you may want to have enough set aside for a 2-year recession. Do you have enough money set aside to wind down the organization? So board members could be personally responsible for the costs if the organization does not have sufficient reserves to wind down the organization. This is certainly something that you should consider in the context of your organization, and it would be something to speak with a legal advisor about, just to ensure that you do truly understand what board members are personally responsible for. In order to determine these first two bullet points and what the reserve fund amount should be, you should perform scenario planning to forecast your organization's future needs. And that would include the cash flow projections that we briefly mentioned earlier, where you're looking at a number of different scenarios. So, how to top up your reserves. For internally restricted funds, it's quite easy. It's done through a board resolution or a policy. So, for example, this is a sample board resolution where you want your operating reserve levels to equal 3 months of our budget operating expenditures. As the organization grows, you'd expect these expenditures to increase, and as a result, additional unrestricted amounts would be restricted. For endowment funds or externally restricted funds, this would be a request for additional funding from the funder.
All right, let's talk about best practices for managing your reserve funds now. Great. So the first tip that we have here is to use class tracking functionality in your accounting software. This is a really great way of capturing revenues and expenses relating to your reserve fund. So this is a very common discussion point that we have with many not-for-profit organizations. It's also an area where the bookkeeping can get messy if you don't have the right processes and controls in place. Really, what this ends up looking like is you have sort of your standard chart of accounts on the one side, as you'd see in sort of a standard profit and loss or income statement. And then along the top, you have the different programs or classes, as we call them. At Ankle, we've developed some pretty straightforward processes around class tracking. Most sort of modern accounting technology does give you the ability to use class tracking. The one that we see the most, of course, is QuickBooks Online. It has class tracking. So this is, of course, very key to managing your reserve funds. Second tip here is to use separate bank accounts and investment accounts. It's easier to track interest income and expenses in relation to a specific fund. So really, what this comes down to is you'll be able to, improve the accuracy considerably. And truth be told, your accountants and bookkeepers will love you for doing this. It just makes the monthly reconciliation process so much more straightforward, reduces the ambiguity. And tying into the previous tip, it actually allows you to to make sure that you're capturing transactions in the appropriate classes more effectively. The third tip here is to have a central document that summarizes the restrictions and reporting requirements associated with all funds. It's really, really important to ensure that management and staff clearly understand the restrictions associated with each fund at all time. So in addition to having this document, it's also really making sure that at a granular level, at a transactional level, people understand what these restrictions entail, so that they can, they can guide their spending appropriately. Fourth tip here, to review the fund transactions on a monthly basis. This is really important to ensure that the funds are used in accordance with the restrictions. And finally, a fifth tip here, making sure that everyone on your team is on the same page. So just really tying into the previous comments, every staff member on your team should have a clear understanding of how the funds can be used and how the funds are to be tracked. Don't underestimate the challenge of this. It can be painful and costly if you get it wrong. For instance, if your bookkeeper doesn't understand how things need to be tracked, unraveling things later on can be very complicated.
And I mean, the worst case scenario is you spend funds in a way that isn't allowed by the donor, which could put you offside with the agreement. So repurposing restricted funds. Repurposing internally restricted funds, as we previously mentioned, requires a board resolution. Repurposing externally restricted funds is something that has come up more in the past 8 months than in my previous 15 years working with not-for-profits. COVID really did result in a cash crunch for a lot of organizations. So that does require consultation with the donor or funder, and you would want to get something in writing. And it's critically important that you do ask and obtain that permission before you use externally restricted funds for anything other than their originally intended purpose. We saw, I'd say, some success with organizations and the ability to do this, and thankfully, after the permission was obtained, not many of our clients had to do that. External audit considerations. This is something near and dear to my heart after 15 years of auditing not-for-profits. So the first thing is make sure that all documentation is available and maintained, including the original agreements and schedules supporting the changes in the balance. Board resolutions should be documented and should be completed before year-end. This point is particularly important for internally restricted funds. If the board wishes to change how the internally restricted funds are, the balances in the internally restricted funds, some auditors are willing to accept that the board had the intent to do this before year-end, but they just didn't have the clear financial picture. Some auditors are not, and they will not be okay with the idea of changing the internally restricted funds at the end of the engagement. And number 3 is consult with your auditor on major strategic and structural changes to avoid any adverse consequences, such as a going concern note or an unexpected contingent liability. The final thoughts, COVID-19 has forced not-for-profit organizations and registered charities to take a hard look at their capitalization, liquidity. Reserve funds are a tool that the organizations can use to manage and plan for the long term, as well as unforeseen challenges. So it's very important to engage in discussions with your stakeholders about your ideas for how these funds should be used, and ensure your accountant understands what these funds are and how they need to be tracked and reported to ensure that you're able to present that information to the appropriate parties.
All right. Jumping into questions.
Awesome. All right. So we've got a lot of questions coming through. We're going to do our best to get to as many as we can, everybody. But I want to start off with kind of a key question that I think is probably on everyone's mind. How can my organization build a reserve if we just don't have enough funds?
So in order to build a reserve fund, the organization, and say this is the first year for the organization, but this would apply for an organization that's been in operations for a number of years. So what happens at the end of the year? The organization will have either a surplus of revenue over expenses or a deficit of revenue over expenses. Let's say you have that surplus. So that surplus initially would be moved into what's called the unrestricted funds. They're the net assets of the organization. In order to set up a reserve fund with that unrestricted reserve, there needs to be a board resolution that transfers that net cash over to a different bucket, which would be the internally restricted fund. Now, if the organization isn't generating a surplus, there's no way to do it immediately. what the organization would need to do is focus on generating additional revenues or cutting back on expenses to help build up that reserve.
Fantastic. And this is also kind of going back to basics here, but we've had a few questions about the actual definitions of the three different types of funds that you were discussing. And I believe that's endowment, the internally restricted, and the externally restricted. Maybe you could go back and just kind of give a sort of broad definition of those three?
Yeah, so internally, let's start with internally. Internally restricted reserve funds are really just the net assets of the organization that have been set aside for a specified purpose. Whether or not that's for your operating reserve, a planned capital project, whatever that might be. A restricted reserves are the externally restricted reserves. Sorry. Are funds that are set aside and are meant for use on a specific project or program, but that specific project or program was funded by a third party. So if we take a look at, we'll say, the National Research Council of Canada. They have a number of different programs where they'll provide the organization with funding. And that funding is meant to be set aside and only used for a specific research project. The end of the year, say you've received $1 million and you spent 500,000 of it on that specific program. At the end of the year, you'd have a $500,000 externally restricted fund. Endowment funds are actually very similar to externally restricted funds, but they tend to be much longer term in nature. You'll be given a certain amount of cash that's meant to be invested, and those funds and the investment returns from those funds are meant to fund future operations, future programs.
Wonderful. And we're getting a lot of questions here about the slide deck. I know there was a lot of really great information on the slides. Yes, you will get the PDF of the slide deck with the video recording. So rest assured that will be coming to you all later today. I've seen a few reports that maybe the bit.ly link isn't working, so we will just check on that as well. So please bear with us on that. Okay, now another question that's been coming up is related to this concept of winding down an organization and the costs that might be associated with that. Would you be able to sort of maybe give some examples of what those costs might be? Because we've had some questions come in around that.
So this does become a little bit more of a legal issue, which I'm not fully qualified to speak to. But when you're winding down an organization, all the assets of the organization would need to be sold, and all of the liabilities of the organization would need to be settled. There are often also legal costs associated with that as well. So you just need to be comfortable that the organization would be able to fund those, or that there's adequate insurance in place. So if you are in a situation where you are concerned that the organization may have to wind down in the foreseeable future, I think that that's worth a conversation with a legal advisor.
Excellent. And another question here, is there a difference between externally restricted funds and deferred revenue? Or is it just a matter of how these are defined at the end of the year versus throughout the year?
They're kind of two sides of the same coin for externally restricted funds. The way the balance sheet works is you get your assets on one side and you get your liability and net assets on the other side. So your externally restricted funds that haven't been spent on the intended purpose, they would sit on one side of the balance sheet, and the deferred revenue would sit on the other side of the balance sheet.
Excellent. And can you also perhaps speak to how donor-advised endowments fit into all of this?
Donor advised endowments. So, if this could be part of the endowment agreement, where the donor has more of an ongoing say in either how the funds are managed or how the funds are to be spent within the organization. They're really just a different. They're a subset of endowment funds.
Perfect. And another question from Kathy. Could you provide a little detail on how an organization might determine the amount of operating reserve in terms of length of time? Should it be 2 months, 3 months, a year? What's best practice around that?
So with something like that, it's a very common question, and it's a very hard question to answer. I think when you're considering how the absolute bare minimum to set aside is, think about what were to happen if the organization were to simply stop generating revenue one day and need to wind down immediately. What sort of expenses would you have to continue to cover? If you have a lease on a building, for example, you might be bound to that for a year. So, and that could be, let's just say that's the only cost. That would be the cost of leasing that building would be the minimum that I would want set aside as an operating reserve. But that's assuming a wind down. If you want to be able to continue into the foreseeable future, you really want to say, okay, if we lose this major funding source, how long would it take us to repivot or to pivot and to be able to raise sufficient funds to cover operations so that we aren't forced into a wind down? And that's where cash flow projections really come into play. Now there are a number of templates available online for cash flow projections, where you basically be looking at how the organization did last year, what you project to be doing over the upcoming year, and you can model that out into the future, and that would include your revenues and your expenses. Now from there you can do scenario planning. So say these three revenue sources end up being 50% of what we need or what we had originally thought, and these expenses actually end up being 10% higher. What does that look like for our organization? How much might we need to have set aside to cover that? So unfortunately, I don't have a straightforward answer for it. I'd like to just say 6 months, and 6 months to me is normally a relatively conservative value that probably covers off a very large number of organizations, but it also may be excessive for a number of organizations. 3 months might be the right number. So I don't want to lead any organization astray and have them set aside more funds than they need to, because those funds can be used to serve the organization's purpose.
Right. And thank you to everyone who's submitting questions. And I'm getting a lot of email questions today, which doesn't always happen. So thanks to those of you who are emailing. And I am going to go to email right now. Penny is asking if you could clarify if an organization's bylaws need to specifically state that the organization is allowed to have internally restricted funds. And again, my apologies if that borders too much into the legal area.
So I can speak to my experience on a board. As an auditor, I didn't spend a lot of time reading the bylaws of organizations. The board that I was on, the reserve funds that we were required to have and allowed to have were specified under the bylaws. And they may have been specified under the operating agreement as well, which was a separate document. So in our case, we were not allowed to set those up, set up any additional reserve funds. Now, I have not come across in the past a not-for-profit or registered charity where the bylaws restrict the board from setting aside any specific reserve funds or creating any internally restricted reserve funds. But it would be something that you'd want to take a read through the bylaws on to determine if it is explicitly disallowed or if only certain reserve funds are allowed for. If there's no mention of them in the bylaws, then you're generally safe to assume that you could set up internally restricted reserve fund. Externally restricted and endowment funds are completely different in terms of the bylaws, and you generally wouldn't have to worry about those unless for some reason they are specifically disallowed in the bylaws. And I've never seen that before.
Excellent. Now, we have, I'm sure, a lot of very small organizations on the line today. I'm sure many of them are sort of asking, we're very small. How do we even start developing a reserve fund?
That ties back to the first question, which is really the organization needs to generate more revenue than it spends in expenditures. It's harkening back to the personal example. It's your savings account, and I'd love to be able to spend more than I make and still be able to build up my retirement savings. But unfortunately, it's just the reality of the situation is you need to generate surpluses in order to start setting up a reserve fund. So this also ties into the danger of balanced budgets. We always hear about a balanced budget during an election cycle and how important it is. And it certainly is important in a lot of ways, but there are certain years where you want to generate a surplus so that you're able to set aside funds for those years when you need to run at a deficit.
The other thing to think about there is, make it a priority from the beginning. But at the beginning, a smaller not-for-profit organization, you may not have a need to put aside as much for the future because the scope of the organization is still quite small. So I think it's making a conscious or making it something that you consciously consider on an ongoing basis and discussion between the board and management to ensure that ultimately the organization is arriving at something that's comfortable even early days.
And on that topic, there's been a few questions about just sort of defining what that means in terms of the surplus from the activities of the organization. Now, assuming that generally cannot come from funding from funders like foundations or grants, is that correct?
Something like that really depends on the nature of the funding. Most funders are donating to a specific purpose. However, there's a lot of fundraising activities that are really meant to help support the ongoing operations of the organization. Grants tend to be for very specific purposes, but I have seen operating grants in the past. So if it's an operating grant, you're not able to generate a surplus from that grant, but you could use it to cover all of your operating expenses, and then take some of those other funding sources and use those to help generate the surplus.
Okay, and is it generally good practice to wipe out a deficit using your reserve fund?
I mean, if it's an operating reserve fund, you essentially have. So if the organization has created a deficit in the net assets, so this would be an overall organizational deficit, then you funded that from your internally restricted funds, and those would be transferred over. To the extent that an organization in 1 year generates a deficit, you can't wipe that out just by transferring funds across from internally restricted to unrestricted, because all of this happens outside of the income statement. These aren't items that impact your net income. This is something that happens down in the net assets section of the balance sheet. So it's really the residual, when we talk about private companies, it's the residual value of the company once all assets and liabilities are accounted for. And with a not-for-profit, it's the residual net assets that are available to fund ongoing operations and programs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and do unrestricted reserves need to be in some kind of investment account, or can they just be moved to separate accounts so that they could be transferred out as needed?
Yeah, they can. They do not need to be in an investment account. Generally, we'll see unrestricted reserves sitting in either a GIC if there's a significant amount, or just in the bank account.
Wonderful. And the other question that I think we're going to handle last here is kind of the opposite. Agnes is asking if you've ever seen organizations that actually have an excessive amount of reserves and what that might look like.
I wish I could. And unfortunately, the reality in the not-for-profit, well, I shouldn't even say unfortunately. I mean, the reality in the not-for-profit world is that to the extent that an organization has a large amount of reserves, they're for very specific purposes, and they tend to be in the endowments. There is a risk for not-for-profits if there isn't a clear intent for use of the funds, and it does have to be fairly excessive, but there is a risk of the CRA questioning whether or not the organization is fulfilling its mandate as a not-for-profit organization or a charity. You do hear about it from time to time in the news, and it was a much bigger focus of the CRA, I'd say 7 or 8 years ago, when they were working on their not-for-profit project, which was an assessment of a various number of not-for-profits across Canada and whether or not they were truly operating as NPOs. Very, very few organizations faced any challenges associated with it. And to me, that means generally not the organizations that were looked at did not have excessive reserves.
Just one little sort of housekeeping matter. For those of you who've opted in to receive emails from us, we will be sending you a copy of this list that you see on the screen. So be sure to stay tuned for this in your inbox. If you did not opt in, you can also access the guide through the link on the slide.
That's great, Omar. And actually, I wanted to touch on that because I know we've had a few folks indicating that maybe the link isn't working for them, and others are saying it is. So, we're going to make sure that we get that link working before we send out the slide deck. So when you get the slide deck, you will be able to access it through that link. And also, we are going to be sending out our usual survey after, along with the recording. There will be a place in that survey where you can pop in your email address. If by chance you didn't sign up originally to receive those follow-up emails through the registration form, you can also put it in there to get that. So there will be definitely opportunities for you to access those resources. I also wanted to thank everybody for putting in so many questions. We haven't been able to get to all of them today, and I do apologize for that, but you do have contact information there on the screen to get in touch with Alex and with Omar, and I know they'd love to hear from you. So please do reach out if you want to start a conversation with them to get more information. Clearly, we could do a round 2 on this, Alex, Omar. It seems like a very popular topic that people want to learn more about. So thank you so much for being here today. Did either of you have any final comments before we wrap up?
No, thank you for having us. It's been great being able to put together some of our experiences, I'd say, over the past 6 months into this webinar.
No, thank you very much. I really appreciated the chance to speak.
Well, it's been a great session and a lot of really great information. So just as a reminder, again, I will say it one more time to everyone that we will follow up by email this afternoon with the webinar recording and the slide deck. You can share that with anyone in your network that would find it helpful. So feel free to share with your board or your leadership team. There will also be that short survey that takes less than 5 minutes to fill out. You'll have an opportunity there to put your email address in to get those follow-up emails, and you'll also be able to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. We'll be sure to share all of your feedback with Omar and Alex as well. Charity Village has lots of resources available to you, whatever it is that you're looking for. We cover everything from volunteer management to hiring to finance, to fundraising. We also have our brand new video interviewing services for recruiting staff and screening volunteers, and our new crowdfunding platform that just launched last week that can help nonprofits and charities diversify their funding sources. So if you have any questions about any of Charity Village resources or services, please do get in touch with us. You can always reach me at webinars@charityvillage.com. Our next free webinar will be held next week on October 22nd. We'll provide an introduction to that crowdfunding platform that I just mentioned, and we'll cover the top 5 elements of a successful crowdfunding campaign. So if you'd like to register for that, watch for the link that will be included in the email that we send out later today. On behalf of Charity Village, thank you so much for taking part in today's webinar, and thank you to Alex and Omar for presenting. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.